My name is Sandra. I'm 32 years old, and 3 years ago, I buried my husband in a plot overlooking the mountains he loved so much. Today's flight to Denver was supposed to be our fresh start, a chance for me and my 7-year-old son Tommy to heal from the tragic car accident that took David from us. But 40 minutes into our flight, Tommy gripped my arm and whispered something that shattered my carefully rebuilt world. Before I share what happened next, please let me know where you're watching from and hit that like button if you've ever felt like your past was chasing you. This story might change how you think about second chances. I met David Martinez during my sophomore year at the University of Colorado. He was this passionate architecture student with calloused hands from weekend construction jobs and eyes that lit up whenever he talked about designing homes that would stand for generations. I was studying nursing, working my way through school with late-night shifts at a local diner. Our first date was a disaster. David showed up an hour late because he'd gotten lost sketching an old Victorian house he'd spotted on the way to pick me up. But when he pulled out that sketch and explained how the original builders had created such intricate woodwork without modern tools, I fell for his passion before I fell for him. We married 3 years later in a small ceremony overlooking the Rocky Mountains. David wore his grandfather's vintage watch, the only thing his family had left him before they passed away when he was 19. I wore my grandmother's pearl necklace, connecting our small family histories into something bigger. We bought our first house in Colorado Springs when I was 26, and David was 27. It was a 1950 ranch-style home that David said had good bones but needed vision. He spent every weekend for 2 years renovating it, teaching himself plumbing and electrical work through YouTube videos and library books. Tommy came along 2 years later, and David transformed overnight from weekend warrior to devoted father. He'd wake up at 5 in the morning to work on architectural drawings so he could be home by 6 every evening for dinner and bath time. Tommy's nursery was David's masterpiece, hand-built shelves shaped like mountain peaks, a ceiling painted to look like Colorado skies, and a mobile David crafted from tiny wooden airplanes. Every detail was planned with the precision of a blueprint, but executed with the love of a father who couldn't wait to share his world with his son. David's architectural firm was small but growing. He specialized in custom mountain homes, working with clients who wanted houses that felt connected to the landscape rather than imposed upon it. His philosophy was simple. A home should feel like it grew from the ground up, not like it was dropped from the sky. He'd spend hours walking potential building sites, sketching angles, and noting how the light changed throughout the day. His clients loved him because he listened to their dreams and then built them something even better than they'd imagined. Those were golden years. David teaching Tommy to cast a fishing line at age 4, the two of them building elaborate model airplane collections on rainy Saturday afternoons, family camping trips where David would point out architectural details in old mining town buildings while I taught Tommy to identify wildflowers. We had plans. David wanted to expand his firm, maybe bring on a partner, so he could spend more time at home. I was considering going back to school for my nurse practitioner degree. Tommy was thriving in kindergarten, making friends, showing signs of his father's spatial intelligence by building incredible structures with blocks and Legos. Everything changed on a Tuesday in February 3 years ago. David had driven up to Vail to meet with potential clients who wanted a modern home that wouldn't disrupt the mountain views. It was supposed to be a day trip, but the meeting ran long, and snow started falling harder than the weather reports had predicted. David called me around 4 in the afternoon, his voice cheerful despite the weather. He said the clients were incredible, that they wanted something challenging and beautiful, that this could be the project that really established his reputation. He promised to drive carefully and be home by 8 for Tommy's bedtime. The call came at 9:30. A state trooper with a voice that sounded too young to be delivering such devastating news. Black ice on Highway 24 just outside Woodland Park. David's truck had slid into oncoming traffic. The other driver, a man hauling equipment to a construction site, survived with minor injuries. David died instantly. The trooper said he wouldn't have suffered that the impact was immediate. I remember thinking how strange it was that someone could disappear from the world while I was making grilled cheese sandwiches and helping Tommy with his homework just 60 miles away. The funeral was a blur of casseroles and condolences of Tommy asking why everyone kept saying Daddy was sleeping when he never slept in a box before. David's clients came, some of them crying harder than I was because grief hadn't hit me yet. It was still floating somewhere outside my body, waiting for the shock to wear off. David's business partner, a kind man named Robert, tried to keep the firm running, but without David's vision and client relationships, projects started falling through. The architectural drawings that had been David's life became legal documents to be sorted and filed. Insurance companies required death certificates and accident reports and statements from witnesses who'd seen the collision happen in slow motion. The life insurance David had purchased when Tommy was born was tied up for months, while investigators confirmed that the accident wasn't suicide, wasn't the result of impaired driving, wasn't anything but terrible luck and dangerous road conditions. I learned that you can't grieve properly when you're fighting bureaucracy for the right to access your own husband's benefits. Money became a constant worry. David's small firm dissolved within 6 months of his death, leaving behind half-finished projects and clients who needed their deposits returned. I picked up extra shifts at the hospital, working 60-hour weeks, while Tommy stayed with my neighbor Mrs. Patterson, a retired teacher who understood that sometimes children need grandmotherly love when the world stops making sense. I'd come home exhausted to find Tommy had built elaborate cities out of blocks, each one featuring a tall building he called Daddy's office. Our dream house became a museum of memories I couldn't afford to maintain. Every room held conversations we'd never finish, projects David had planned, but never started, spaces that felt too big for 2 people instead of 3. The mortgage payments were manageable with 2 incomes, but crushing with 1. I spent a year trying to make it work, taking on weekend shifts, selling David's tools and truck cutting every expense I could identify. But eventually, the math was unavoidable. We had to sell. Finding a buyer was emotional torture. Couples would walk through our home pointing out features David had installed, discussing changes they wanted to make to his carefully planned renovations. I wanted to tell them about the thought behind every choice, how David had positioned the kitchen windows to catch morning light because he knew I liked to watch the sunrise while drinking coffee. But houses become just structures when their stories don't transfer with the deed. Tommy stopped talking for 3 months after David died. Not completely, but his chatter disappeared. He'd answer direct questions with yes or no, but the constant stream of observations and questions that had defined his personality simply vanished. His teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was patient and understanding, but she was also concerned. We started seeing a child psychologist named Dr. Williams, who specialized in helping children process grief. Dr. Williams explained that children Tommy's age don't understand death the way adults do. They think in concrete terms, and death is the most abstract concept humans face. Tommy kept asking when Daddy would come back from his trip, when the box would open, so Daddy could come home. It took months of gentle explanations and play therapy for him to begin accepting that death meant forever. The turning point came 8 months after the accident. Tommy and I were sorting through David's desk, deciding what to keep and what to donate. Tommy found his father's passport and travel journal, a leather-bound notebook where David had written about places he wanted to visit. Cities with interesting architecture, mountain towns with historical buildings, national parks where he wanted to take his family camping. Tommy couldn't read all the words, but he understood the sketches David had made of famous buildings and bridges. "Mom," Tommy said, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "Can we go to the places Dad wanted to see?" It was the longest sentence he'd spoken since the funeral, and it was the first time he'd expressed curiosity about anything beyond his immediate needs. I looked at the list David had compiled: Denver for the Art Museum and Downtown Architecture, Savannah for the Historic District, Santa Fe for the adobe buildings that had inspired some of his designs. I realized we both needed something to look forward to, some way to honor David's dreams while creating new experiences of our own. Travel had never been a priority when money was tight, and David's business was growing, but now it felt like the map for rebuilding our lives. I started researching destinations and prices, setting aside small amounts from each paycheck planning adventures that would connect us to David's interests while helping us discover our own. The decision to visit Denver came naturally. It was close enough for a weekend trip, but far enough to feel like a real adventure. David had always talked about the architecture there, the way the city balanced modern skyscrapers with historic buildings, how the mountains provided a dramatic backdrop that influenced the way architects thought about scale and proportion. He'd sketched buildings from photographs, but never had the chance to see them in person. I booked our flights for a Friday morning in October, thinking the fall weather would be perfect for walking around the city. Tommy was beside himself with excitement. At 8 years old, he'd never been on an airplane, never stayed in a hotel, never taken a trip that wasn't to visit relatives or go camping. For weeks before our departure, he checked and rechecked his small backpack, making sure he had everything he might need for his first flight. The morning of our trip, Tommy woke up at 5:30, 2 hours before our alarm was set to go off. He was dressed and sitting by the front door when I stumbled out of my bedroom, his backpack on his shoulders and his father's old baseball cap perched on his head. "Is it time to go to the airport yet, Mom?" he asked, bouncing slightly on his toes. I made him eat breakfast and repack his bag one more time, but his enthusiasm was infectious. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely excited about something. The drive to Denver International Airport took an hour, and Tommy spent the entire time with his nose pressed against the window, commenting on everything we passed. "Look at that building, Mom. Dad would have liked how they made the windows look like they're reaching up. Do you think our airplane will be bigger than that truck? When we land, will Dad's ghost be able to see us from heaven?" The questions were endless, and I found myself laughing more than I had since before the accident. Security at the airport was Tommy's first real adventure. He was fascinated by the X-ray machines, disappointed that he couldn't keep his shoes on, and completely amazed by the scale of the terminal. "It's like a city inside a building," he said, and I could hear David's influence in the way he noticed architectural details. The waiting area by our gate had huge windows overlooking the runway, and Tommy pressed his face against the glass to watch planes take off and land. Our flight was on a smaller regional jet, nothing fancy, but to Tommy, it might as well have been a spaceship. I'd splurged on a window seat for him, knowing that his first view of the Earth from above would be something he'd remember forever. The flight attendant, a kind woman named Patricia, who looked like she had grandchildren Tommy's age, spent extra time explaining how seatbelts worked and what would happen during takeoff. As our plane lifted off the runway, Tommy's excitement was palpable. He gripped my hand during the initial acceleration, his eyes wide with wonder as the ground fell away beneath us. "Mom, look. The cars look like toys. The houses look like the models Dad used to build." His joy was pure and uncomplicated, the kind of happiness that makes adults remember why simple pleasures matter. The flight to Denver was scheduled for an hour and 20 minutes, short enough that Tommy wouldn't get restless, but long enough for him to fully experience flying. Once we reached cruising altitude, he settled into his seat with a coloring book and the airplane safety card, which he found endlessly fascinating. "Mom, did you know there are life jackets under our seats? And oxygen masks will fall down if the air gets thin." I pulled out a book I'd been trying to read for months, a mystery novel that had been sitting on my nightstand since before David died. The airplane's gentle vibration and the soft hum of engines was surprisingly soothing. For the first time in years, I felt like I could relax completely. Tommy was safe beside me, chattering quietly to himself as he colored. We were on an adventure that honored David's memory while creating new experiences for ourselves. Everything felt right. About 40 minutes into the flight, I was finally getting absorbed in my book when Tommy suddenly gripped my arm. His small fingers dug into my sleeve with surprising strength, and when I looked up from my page, his face was pressed against the airplane window. But he was staring forward into the cabin, not outside at the landscape below. "Mom," he whispered, his voice tight with excitement and something that sounded almost like fear. "Look, that's Dad." My book tumbled from my lap as I followed Tommy's pointed finger. 3 rows ahead of us on the aisle side sat a man with dark brown hair, cut in a familiar style. He was wearing a navy blue jacket similar to one David had owned, and from behind the resemblance was striking. The same broad shoulders, the same way of holding his head slightly tilted when he was thinking. My heart stopped beating for what felt like several seconds. "Tommy, sweetie," I whispered, trying to keep my voice calm, even though my hands were shaking. "That's not Dad. Remember what we talked about? Sometimes people look like other people we know." But Tommy wasn't listening to my rational explanations. He was leaning forward in his seat, straining against his seatbelt, his voice getting louder with excitement. "Mom, he has Dad's watch. Look at his left hand. And see how he taps his fingers when he's thinking. That's exactly what Dad used to do." Other passengers were starting to notice Tommy's excitement. An elderly woman across the aisle smiled at what she probably assumed was a child's overactive imagination, but her expression grew concerned when she saw how pale I'd become. I forced myself to look more carefully at the man Tommy was pointing toward, and my rational mind began to war with what my eyes were seeing. The man's left wrist did indeed sport a watch that looked remarkably similar to David's vintage timepiece, the one his grandfather had passed down to him. And as I watched, the man lifted his right hand to rub his temple in a gesture that was so achingly familiar, I had to grip the armrest to steady myself. David used to do exactly that when he was concentrating on a difficult architectural problem. "Sweetie, I need you to lower your voice," I said to Tommy, but my own voice sounded strange and distant. "Other passengers are trying to rest." Tommy looked at me with the kind of 8-year-old logic that cuts straight through adult pretense. "But Mom, if that's Dad, we should go talk to him. Maybe he doesn't know where we are. Maybe he's looking for us too." The flight attendant approached our row, probably responding to the elevated voices in obvious distress. "Is everything all right here?" Patricia asked, her professional smile tinged with genuine concern. "Everything's fine," I managed to say. "My son just thinks he recognizes someone." But everything was not fine. As the man 3 rows ahead adjusted his position, turning slightly toward the window, I caught a glimpse of his profile. The slope of his nose, the angle of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead, were all devastatingly familiar. If I hadn't attended David's funeral, if I hadn't watched them lower his casket into the ground, if I hadn't signed death certificates and insurance claims, I would have sworn I was looking at my husband. Tommy was becoming increasingly agitated, his whispered "Dad, Dad, Dad," growing louder despite my attempts to quiet him. "Mom, why isn't he turning around? Doesn't he hear me calling him?" I found myself studying the man's every movement with an intensity that felt almost predatory. When he reached up to adjust the air vent above his seat, his movement was fluid and confident, exactly like David's habitual gestures. When he pulled out a magazine and began flipping through it, he held it at the same angle David always did, tilted slightly to catch the overhead light. The rational part of my mind kept insisting this was impossible. David was dead. I had seen his body in the hospital. I had identified him for the coroner. I had watched dirt being shoveled onto his grave. But the emotional part of my mind, the part that had been grieving and missing him for 3 years, was screaming that miracles could happen, that maybe there had been a mistake, that maybe the universe was giving us a second chance. "Mom," I'm going to go talk to him, Tommy announced, starting to unbuckle his seatbelt. No, I said, grabbing his hands. Tommy, you cannot get up during the flight. It's not safe, and it's not allowed. But I understood his impulse because I was fighting the same urge. Every instinct in my body was telling me to march up that aisle and tap the man on the shoulder to demand that he turn around and explain how he could look so much like my dead husband. The logical part of my mind kept providing reasonable explanations. Lots of people have similar builds, similar hair, similar mannerisms. Grief can make us see things that aren't there. The mind plays tricks when it wants something desperately enough. Yet the longer I watched, the more similarities I noticed. The man shifted in his seat and crossed his left leg over his right, exactly the way David always sat when he was reading. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out what looked like reading glasses, the same style David had started wearing for close work in the months before his death. When the flight attendant came by offering drinks, I heard the man order coffee with cream, no sugar, the same way David took his coffee every morning for the 8 years we were married. His voice was similar too, though I couldn't hear it clearly enough from 3 rows away to be certain. I knew I had to get a closer look, but I also knew I had to protect Tommy from what was likely to be a painful disappointment. I'm going to use the restroom, I told him. Stay in your seat and keep your seatbelt on. Can I come with you? Can we walk past Dad on the way? Tommy, that is not your father. I need you to understand that. We're going to walk past someone who looks like Dad, but it's not him. Do you understand? Tommy nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe me. How could he? Even I was struggling to convince myself that this was just an extraordinary coincidence. I made my way up the narrow aisle, my heart pounding so hard I was sure other passengers could hear it. As I approached the man's row, I slowed my pace, trying to get a clear view of his face without being obvious about it. When I was directly beside his seat, he looked up from his magazine, and I found myself staring into eyes that were almost David's, but not quite. The man had David's general facial structure, the same coloring, the same basic features, but the details were different. His eyes were a slightly different shade of brown. His nose was a fraction wider. His chin was more square than oval. He looked like David might have looked if David had been his own cousin rather than himself. The resemblance was close enough to be shocking, but different enough to be clearly another person. Excuse me, the man said politely, noticing that I had stopped walking and was staring at him. Are you all right? His voice was similar to David's, but deeper, with a slight accent I couldn't place. I realized I was standing in the aisle like a statue, blocking other passengers, probably looking like I'd seen a ghost, which in a way I had. I'm sorry, I stammered. You just look very much like someone I used to know. The man smiled kindly. I get that sometimes. People tell me I have one of those faces. I nodded and continued toward the restroom, my mind spinning. The man was definitely not David, but the resemblance was extraordinary. I understood why Tommy had been so convinced. From behind, especially at a distance, the similarity was uncanny. Even up close, the differences were subtle enough that grief and wishful thinking could easily blur them. In the tiny airplane restroom, I splashed cold water on my face and tried to collect myself. I needed to return to Tommy with a clear explanation that would satisfy his 8-year-old logic without crushing his hope entirely. I needed to prepare him for the landing, for the continuation of our trip, for the fact that we were still just the two of us, rebuilding our lives together. When I returned to my seat, Tommy was practically vibrating with anticipation. Did you talk to him? What did he say? Did he remember us? Tommy, I need you to listen to me very carefully. That man is not your father. He looks like Dad, but he's someone else entirely. His name is different, his voice is different, and he doesn't know us." Tommy's face fell, but I could see him processing this information. "But Mom, he looks exactly like Dad." "I know he does, sweetheart. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes we meet people who remind us of someone we love. It doesn't mean that person is still with us, but it can feel like a little gift, like a way of remembering good things about them." The man ahead of us was still reading his magazine, occasionally adjusting his position or reaching for his coffee. Now that I knew he wasn't David, I could see the differences more clearly. His hands were larger than David's had been. His hair was cut slightly differently. His jacket was a different shade of blue. But the overall impression, especially from behind, was still startlingly similar. As our plane began its descent into Denver, Tommy pressed his face against the window again, but his earlier excitement was tempered by disappointment. "Mom, do you think Dad would be happy that we came to see the buildings he wanted to see?" "I think Dad would be very proud of us for being brave enough to take this trip," I said. "And I think he'd love knowing that you noticed all those architectural details the way he would have." The landing was smooth, and as passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark, I found myself watching the man who looked like David. He moved with confidence and purpose, pulling a small carry-on bag from the overhead compartment, checking his phone for messages. He was clearly traveling alone, clearly comfortable with the routine of air travel. When it was our turn to exit the plane, Tommy walked slowly past the man's seat, stealing glances but no longer calling out. As we reached the jet bridge, Tommy turned back for one last look. The man was still gathering his things, and for just a moment, the angle of the overhead light and the way he held his head created such a perfect silhouette of David that my breath caught in my throat all over again. At baggage claim, I thought our encounter with the David look-alike was over. Tommy and I stood by the carousel waiting for our suitcases, talking about our plans for the weekend and the architecture sites we wanted to visit. Tommy seemed to have processed the airplane incident and moved on to excitement about the hotel pool and the possibility of seeing real mountains from our room. But as I reached for our first suitcase, Tommy suddenly darted away from my side. I turned to see him running across the baggage claim area toward a figure I recognized immediately. The man from the plane was standing near the exit, checking his phone, completely unaware that an 8-year-old boy was approaching him at full speed. "Tommy, no!" I called, dropping our suitcase and chasing after him. But Tommy was faster and more determined than I had anticipated. He reached the man before I could catch him and tugged urgently on the sleeve of his navy jacket. Dad, it's me, Tommy. We were on the same airplane." The man looked down in complete confusion and alarm. Up close in the bright lights of the airport, the differences between him and David were even more apparent. But I could see why Tommy was still convinced. The man had the same basic build, the same general coloring, the same way of carrying himself that David had possessed. "I'm sorry," the man said, kneeling down to Tommy's level with a concerned expression. "I think you have me confused with someone else, buddy." I reached them just as Tommy's face began to crumple with realization. "But you look just like my dad," Tommy said, his voice small and confused. "You have his watch and everything." The man glanced at his wrist, then looked up at me with understanding and compassion in his eyes. "I'm Michael Chen," he said, extending his hand. "And I'm guessing there's a story here." I introduced myself and briefly explained that Tommy's father had died 3 years ago, that the resemblance was remarkable, that Tommy had been convinced throughout the flight that he'd found his dad. Michael listened with the kind of patient attention that suggested he understood loss himself. "I'm so sorry for your loss," Michael said, and then turned back to Tommy. "It must be hard when you miss your dad so much." Tommy nodded, tears starting to flow. He was an architect like you might be because you were looking at building pictures on the airplane. Michael's eyebrows rose slightly. Actually, I am an architect. That's quite a guess. My dad loved buildings, Tommy continued. He wanted to come to Denver to see the architecture here, but he died in a car accident before we could take the trip. So Mom and I came without him. I watched Michael's expression soften even further. Instead of making polite excuses and walking away, which would have been perfectly reasonable, he seemed genuinely moved by Tommy's story. What kind of buildings did your dad like to design? Michael asked. Houses in the mountains, Tommy said, wiping his nose with his sleeve. He said they should look like they grew out of the ground instead of being dropped from the sky. Michael smiled. That's good design philosophy. Your dad sounds like he was a thoughtful architect. I found myself studying Michael more carefully as he talked with Tommy. His kindness seemed genuine rather than polite. He had a calm presence that reminded me of David's professional demeanor when he was talking with clients' children or explaining architectural concepts to people who weren't in the field. Are you visiting Denver or do you live here? I asked. I just moved here, actually, Michael said. I'm starting a new job with a firm that specializes in sustainable mountain architecture, probably working on exactly the kind of projects your husband would have appreciated. The coincidences were starting to feel almost eerie. Not only did Michael look remarkably like David, but he was also an architect, working in David's specialty area, moving to a city David had wanted to visit, apparently sharing similar professional interests and values. We're here for the weekend, I said. Tommy wanted to see the places his dad had written about in his travel journal. What places specifically? Michael asked. Tommy pulled out a folded piece of paper from his pocket, a copy I'd made of the relevant pages from David's journal. The art museum, the downtown buildings, and something called the Daniels and Fisher Tower. Michael's eyes lit up. Those are great choices. I actually work part-time at the Denver Art Museum giving architecture tours. The building itself is as interesting as what's inside it. Tommy looked up at me with hope in his eyes. Mom, could Mr. Michael show us the buildings Dad wanted to see? I felt torn between wanting to give Tommy this connection to his father's interests and not wanting to impose on a stranger who'd already been incredibly patient with our family drama. I'm sure Mr. Chen has his own plans for the weekend. Actually, Michael said, I don't have any solid plans. I'm still pretty new to the city myself. If you'd like some company exploring, I'd be happy to show you around. Consider it a welcome to Denver gift. 3 hours later, I found myself walking through downtown Denver with a man who looked enough like my dead husband to be his twin brother. Watching my son absorb architectural details with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen since before David's death. Michael had suggested we start with the 16th Street Mall and work our way toward the art museum, stopping at several buildings David had specifically mentioned in his travel journal. Our first stop was the Brown Palace Hotel, a triangular building from 1892 that David had sketched from photographs. Tommy was fascinated by the atrium lobby, the way natural light filtered down through multiple floors, the geometric patterns in the floor tiles. Michael explained how the architects had solved the problem of the unusual triangular lot by making the shape part of the building's appeal, rather than trying to hide it. Your dad was right to put this on his list, Michael told Tommy. This building shows how good architects turn challenges into opportunities. At the Daniels and Fisher Tower, Michael pointed out details that David had noted in his journal. The clock faces the terracotta ornamentation, the way the building seemed to grow taller as you looked up. Tommy asked questions I never would have thought of. Why were the windows different sizes on different floors? How did they get the clock to work? What was the building used for originally? I found myself watching Michael as much as I was looking at the buildings. His approach to architecture was different from David's, but equally passionate. Where David had been romantic about traditional craftsmanship and historical details, Michael was excited by innovation and sustainability. He talked about green building techniques, energy efficiency, and designing structures that worked with natural systems rather than against them. "Your husband sounds like he appreciated the artistic side of architecture," Michael said as we walked toward the art museum. "I'm more interested in the scientific side, how buildings can actually improve the environment instead of just avoiding harming it." "Dad would have liked learning about that," Tommy said. "He always said buildings should be good neighbors to the places where they're built." At the Denver Art Museum, Michael's expertise really showed. He led us through galleries I would have walked past, explaining how the building's unusual angular design was meant to reflect the mountain landscape visible through the windows. Tommy was particularly fascinated by a scale model of the building that showed how all the strange angles fit together into a coherent whole. "It looks like it's dancing," Tommy observed, and Michael grinned. "That's exactly what the architect intended. He wanted people to feel like the building was alive and moving." As the afternoon progressed, I realized I was enjoying myself in a way I hadn't expected. Michael was easy to talk to, knowledgeable, without being pretentious, and genuinely interested in Tommy's questions and observations. He didn't seem to be trying to replace David or compete with his memory. Instead, he was offering Tommy a different perspective on their shared interest in architecture. When Tommy ran ahead to examine a sculpture outside the museum, Michael and I found ourselves walking alone for the first time since the airport. "I hope this isn't too strange for you," I said. "I know the resemblance must be obvious, and this probably isn't how you plan to spend your weekend." Michael was quiet for a moment before responding. "Can I tell you something? I lost my parents in a car accident when I was 12. I was raised by my grandparents, who were wonderful, but I always felt like I was missing some essential piece of my identity. When I became an architect, it was partly because I wanted to build something permanent, something that would last longer than any individual life." He paused, watching Tommy examine the museum's exterior details. "What happened today, meeting you and Tommy, seeing how much his father's work meant to him, it reminds me why I chose this profession. Buildings aren't just structures. They're ways of connecting with people across time, of leaving something meaningful behind." I felt an unexpected surge of emotion at his words. "David would have liked you," I said. "You think about architecture the way he did, as something bigger than just making pretty buildings." "I wish I could have met him," Michael said. "Based on Tommy's stories and the places he chose to visit, he sounds like he was a thoughtful designer." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the city, I realized our accidental tour had become something more significant than I'd anticipated. Tommy was running back toward us, his face bright with excitement about everything he'd learned. For the first time since David's death, I could see my son connecting with his father's passion through someone else's knowledge and enthusiasm. "Mom, can we have dinner with Mr. Michael?" Tommy asked. "I want to show him Dad's sketches of the buildings we saw today." I looked at Michael, unsure whether we were imposing or whether he genuinely wanted to continue spending time with us. His smile seemed to answer my question before I could ask it. "I know a great restaurant with a view of the mountains," he said. "We can compare your dad's sketches with the real buildings." 6 months later, I was sitting in my kitchen in Colorado Springs, video chatting with Michael, while Tommy worked on homework at the dining room table. What had started as an accidental meeting had developed into something I never could have planned or expected, a friendship that honored David's memory while opening space for new experiences and perspectives. Michael had become a regular part of our lives, but not in the way well-meaning friends had predicted when I told them about meeting someone. He wasn't trying to replace David or become Tommy's new father. Instead, he had carved out his own unique role as Tommy's architecture mentor and my trusted friend. Our relationship was built on shared interests, mutual respect, and an understanding that some connections transcend simple categories. Tommy's grief had evolved too. He still missed his father deeply, still talked about him regularly, still kept David's sketches and tools in a special box in his bedroom. But he had stopped expecting David to return and started celebrating the ways David's influence continued to shape his own interests and personality. Tommy had joined an after-school architecture club, started drawing his own building designs, and announced his intention to become an architect, like both his dad and Mr. Michael. My own healing had been more complicated. The initial shock of seeing someone who looked so much like David had forced me to confront how much of my identity had become wrapped up in being David's widow. I had been defining myself by my loss rather than by my own qualities and potential. Meeting Michael had reminded me that I was still a whole person with interests, opinions, and dreams of my own. I had taken a promotion at the hospital that required some travel to other facilities in our health system. The job paid better and challenged me professionally in ways I hadn't experienced since before Tommy was born. Travel, which had once seemed impossible as a single mother, became manageable with the support network I'd built and Tommy's growing independence. Tommy and I had taken 2 more trips together to Santa Fe to see the adobe architecture David had admired, and to Chicago to visit the skyscrapers he'd studied in college. On both trips, we video called Michael to share our discoveries, and he provided context and explanations that enriched our experiences. These adventures had become our new tradition, a way of staying connected to David's interests while creating fresh memories of our own. Michael visited Colorado Springs once a month, usually staying in a hotel downtown and spending Saturday with Tommy and me exploring local architecture or working on building projects in our garage. Tommy was learning to use basic tools to read simple blueprints, to think about space and proportion the way architects do. These visits never felt like dates or attempts to recreate a nuclear family. They felt like friendship, mentorship, and shared purpose. The most significant change was in my understanding of love and loss. I had learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting, that moving forward doesn't mean leaving the past behind, that opening your heart to new experiences doesn't diminish your capacity to honor old relationships. David would always be Tommy's father and my first love, but our hearts had proven to be bigger than I'd imagined. Michael had taught me that love isn't a finite resource that gets used up. The love I felt for David remained intact and unchanged, but it had made space for different kinds of love. Friendship, love, mentor, love, the love that comes from shared values and mutual support. I wasn't replacing David with Michael. I was adding Michael to a life that would always include David's influence and memory. Tommy understood this better than I had expected. When his school counselor asked him to draw a picture of his family, he drew himself in the middle with David on one side, wearing angel wings and holding architectural tools, and Michael on the other side, wearing a hard hat and holding building plans. At the bottom, he wrote, "My family is bigger than it looks." The anniversary of David's death had been difficult, as it was every year, but for the first time, I had felt hope alongside the grief. Tommy and I visited David's grave with flowers and a photo album of our architectural adventures. We told him about the buildings we'd seen, the things we'd learned, the ways his passion for design continued to influence our lives. It felt like a conversation rather than a one-sided memorial. "I think Dad would be proud of us," Tommy said as we walked back to the car. "We're still doing the things he loved, but we're adding new things too." That night, I called Michael to tell him about our cemetery visit. He listened without offering advice or trying to minimize the complexity of our emotions. He had learned that grief and growth can coexist, that some relationships defy simple definitions, that the best kind of support involves witness rather than solutions. "David sounds like he was a remarkable person," Michael said. "I'm honored to be part of carrying forward his influence in Tommy's life." "He would have liked you," I said, and I meant it. "You both understand that buildings are about more than just shelter." They're about creating spaces where life can flourish. As I finish telling you this story, I'm reminded that life rarely unfolds according to our plans. 3 years ago, I thought my story was over, that I was destined to be defined by loss and limited by grief. I couldn't have imagined that a case of mistaken identity on an airplane would become the catalyst for rebuilding my understanding of family love and possibility. The man who looked like my husband turned out to be exactly what Tommy and I needed, not a replacement for what we'd lost, but a bridge to what we could become. Michael taught us that honoring the past and embracing the future aren't opposing forces. They're complementary aspects of a life fully lived. Tommy is now 9 years old, confident and curious, still missing his father, but no longer defined by that absence. He talks about becoming an architect who designs houses that help families grow and buildings that make the earth happier. His vocabulary combines David's romantic view of architecture with Michael's scientific approach, creating something entirely his own. I've learned that the heart's capacity for love is elastic and generous. Loving David completely didn't prevent me from developing deep friendship with Michael. Missing David terribly didn't stop me from appreciating the gifts Michael brought to our lives. The human heart, it turns out, is designed for abundance rather than scarcity. Sometimes, the people who look like our past are actually messengers from our future, reminding us that it's okay to keep living, keep loving, and keep believing in tomorrow. Sometimes, what feels like a cruel trick of fate is actually grace in disguise, offering us exactly what we need even when we don't know we need it. I want to ask you something. Have you ever experienced a moment when the past and future seem to collide in an unexpected way? Have you found that healing sometimes comes through the most surprising connections? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because I'd love to hear about your own experiences with lost hope and the unexpected ways life provides exactly what we need. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and consider subscribing for more real-life stories about resilience, love, and the beautiful complexity of human relationships. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that our capacity for joy isn't diminished by our capacity for grief, that new chapters don't erase old ones, they simply add depth to the story we're still writing. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of this community where we can share our experiences honestly and support each other through all of life's unexpected turns. I hope your own journey is filled with surprising connections, healing moments, and the kind of love that expands rather than replaces what came before.